Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. Today, we're here to talk about rubbish, recycling to be more specific. This here is our recycling bin, that's here in our house. And for the past 2 years, we have been diligently going through it all and sorting it all out. But according to our local rubbish collector, we needn't have bothered because all of this stuff here goes into an incinerator or into landfill. And we're not alone. It's a global problem. So what is happening to the recycling industry? We're joined here today by Vivienne Walt, a writer for Fortune and Time magazines. Last year, she wrote about the global crisis in recycling in Fortune, and the article was cited by the Pulitzer Committee as one of the best articles of the year. Hello, Viv.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great to have you with us here. We're also joined by Graham Forbes, Greenpeace's global project leader on plastics. Hello, Graham.
Hi, Nicholas. Great to be with you.
We'll be speaking to you in just a bit, but we're going to start here with Viv as I put my rubbish bin away. In an ideal world, what should be happening to the stuff next to me here, Viv?
By the way, I also see your rubbish bin is made of plastic. I mean, in the ideal world, in my ideal world, you would be reusing those bottles over and over again for many different reasons. You'd be taking them to the store and getting them refilled with whatever it is was in there in the first place. In the slightly less ideal world, they might be made out of plastics that are maybe dissolvable or easily biodegradable. That's being worked on at the moment. I'm sure Graham might have more information about that. The very worst thing that should be happening with them, that should not be happening with them, is probably what's happening with them at the moment, which is very, very, very little of it is getting recycled, despite the fact that we put everything in recycling.
Your story traced, I mean, one of the great things you did in your story is you traced the rubbish from somewhere in Long Island and saw what it went to, and you ended up in Malaysia. So, and I know a lot has happened with recycling the last couple of years, so this is a more complicated story than one might initially think. But municipalities, councils around in Europe and the States and Australia have recycling systems, but those things have gone wrong. So can you take us on that journey? So what do they think should be happening? Theoretically, when I put this bottle in the bin here and it's taken out by the trash collector, I think it's being broken up into small pieces and then recycled again. But what's happening?
Well, probably some tiny fraction of the plastic that you put in your recycling bins does wind up as those teeny weeny little plastic pellets, which are called nurdles, which are then made into other plastic things. But that's probably about 8% of the world's plastic. What we did was we began in Long Island, as you say, near New York, in a town called Smithtown. There's maybe 100,000 people there. Now, Smithtown actually used to earn a pretty good penny selling its plastic. It would collect plastic junk from everybody, and it would sell it to recyclers who would then ship it off to China. China was where 70% of America's plastic wound up until a couple of years ago. And China would then make recycled plastic out of it. Two major things happened since then. China decided enough of this, we're drowning in plastic and it's worth nothing, or it's certainly, you know, the price is collapsing. And they put a law in place where they would only accept the very, very, very best, completely uncontaminated plastic. That's less than 1% of the world's plastic. And the other big thing that happened was the collapse of the world oil prices. And it just became so cheap to create petrochemicals, the raw materials for plastic. And it also became very important for the oil companies because more and more people are driving electric cars and not wanting oil. And oil demand 50 years out is certainly, you know, on a fairly dramatic downward trajectory. And the big oil companies, Exxon, Chevron, all these companies see production of plastic as being the one growth area that they can hang on to.
So just to repeat that point, the key point there is that the price of recycled plastic, I mean, the actual being able to sell it, that plummeted, and it was far cheaper. It's far cheaper to make new plastics now. And the other thing is that the biggest market, the biggest of place where you could one of the biggest places where you could export plastics to, closed its ports, literally.
By far the biggest place, yes.
Yeah. And then, but there are some places that still take it. And you went to Malaysia. So can you tell us a bit about what you saw there?
It was really extraordinary, Nick, because we went, and now Malaysia is a pretty developed country. It's not like we were out in, the middle of nowhere. But really up in the very remote villages in northern Malaysia, these places have been turned into recycling hubs for the world. So you could walk into these new factories that have been built in the middle of like palm oil plantations, for example, where in these huge warehouses, you could walk around and there was the plastic trash from California, Britain, Australia, New Zealand. I mean, we saw it all. And from there, it's put on a very labor-intensive production to separate out the hundreds of different kinds of plastics and turn them eventually into these sacks of what's called nurdles, these kind of like little lentil-sized, colorless pieces of plastic. The other thing we did was we traveled around the country with the plastics recycling trading guy. We all talk about recycling. We all sort of like know what the governments are trying to do, but when you see the actual recycling global business in action, it's extraordinary, because it's basically these fly-by-night operations, these guys who are sitting around, over cups of tea and, endless, enormous Chinese lunches by the side of the road, making deals on, they can get like, 10 tons of plastic hangers that they're buying from some supplier in LA that they're going to sell to this guy in this tiny town in Malaysia, and he's going to turn them into some kind of recycled plastic and hope to find a market for it.
Yeah, and I think one of the tragic elements of that was because the bottom has fallen out of the market, a lot of these sort of piles of rubbish, and including the stuff that some of it's been processed, has just been dumped and burned, and the impact on the local community. You visited a local family that was suffering quite considerably because of the amount of trash that was being burnt next to them.
Absolutely, and I mean, I've worked in a lot of countries where, people really do not want us around. And I didn't expect such hostile reaction in a place like Malaysia. But in fact, we wound up having to kind of hide from people and be having, many, many doors slammed in our face because people just did not want to reveal what was going on. There was a lot of dumping into the rivers, which feed the fish stocks, and the farmland. A lot of factories had been built completely illegally with no regulation whatsoever. Luckily, we had packed a very good drone, and many times what we did was we just drove around the corner, parked our car, and sent a drone up over the factories to take a look at what was going on. It was the only way that we would ever get any kind of feel for, what it was like inside. So it was more of an adventure than we bargained for.
Amazing. I'm slightly worried about the video connection here, but Isabel's standing by, and I'm going to turn to Graham in a second. If Isabel could just bring up the slide we've got, I do recommend people look at the article in Fortune, because it's a very in-depth article, but we've got a slide here from this that shows you the amount of plastic that is still in the environment and how little is being is being recycled. Graham, can I turn to you? I think Viv has summed up how the system has broken down, but it would seem that there's that this is an insurmountable problem. This is a colossal problem. And just looking at this graphic here, the amount of plastics within our environment in the world, unprocessed, is colossal, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And as Vivienne noted in her article, less than 10% of the plastics ever created have been recycled. And I think a helpful way to think about recycling is it's really one of the greatest corporate lies of our lifetime, in the sense that the promise of plastics recycling was never really meant to deal with the amount that is actually produced. And it does two things. By putting the focus and the emphasis on recycling and this idea that people can collect what these companies produce, is it puts the responsibility on the individual and on governments to take care, local governments largely, to take care of this waste problem. And at the end of the day, it diverts responsibility from those responsible for producing it. And that's a massive problem, and one that Greenpeace is really working to address, which is put responsibility back on the producers and really look at plastics for its entire life cycle, which moves you upstream towards production. You know, well, plastic production industry expects, and I think would like to see capacity double in the next 10 years. And given what we're already seeing with plastic in the marine environment, and plastic really ending up in our food and our drinking water in the furthest corners of the planet, it's insurmountable, the idea that we would recycle our way out of this crisis. And so it really comes down to companies like Coca-Cola and Unilever moving past the idea of recycling and moving towards reuse, and reusing products and reusing materials, and thinking about systems in a much more fundamental way than we are now, which is limited sort of to this end of pipe thinking around recycling.
Viv, do you want to just sort of chip in there?
Yeah, no, I wanted to, I mean, Graham can probably talk more about this, but one of the surprising and interesting things I found during my reporting was all the lobbying that the chemical industry was doing, certainly in the US for sure. Billions and billions of dollars worth of lobbying to set themselves up as like pro-environmentalists. You know, all of these organizations are, you know, so-called end plastic waste, clean up the oceans, everything, all the emphasis is about, as Graham was saying, the emphasis is all about, you know, don't dump plastic, recycle it, etc. It's not ever about let's stop producing plastic at the rate that we're producing it, or let's, you know, make ourselves responsible for, say, let's pay for the recycling. For example, you know, they say, well, you know, by the chemical industry in the US, and Graham, please correct me if I'm wrong, because it's been several months since I did this reporting, but they say, okay, by 2040, we're going to make everything recyclable. By 2050, I believe everything's going to be recycled. But they never actually spell out who's going to pay for that or how they're going to do that. It seems to me completely like dodging the real question, and which seems to me to be the only answer, which is that you actually have to stop supplying so much plastic. Plastic is just too good to resist. You're going to have to, at some point, stop producing so much of it. Otherwise, you just simply can't get, rebalance the equilibrium at all.
Yeah, I think Vivienne's spot on. And I think the American Chemistry Council has really defined the US position on a global plastics treaty for the last 4 years, which is something that we're hoping is going to change. And if you look at how the chemical industry and the fossil fuel industry has worked with the consumer goods sector on the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, they hired a bunch of marketing people, and they really have all of these sort of the shiny graphics that again point the problem towards Asia, list a number of new innovative recycling projects. The goal, all they need to do, and the primary goal of that vehicle, is to continue the myth of recycling and continue this cultural myth that as long that there is some hope that we could recycle what they produce, because it allows them license to continue the billions of dollars of investment in new production, which, as Vivienne rightly pointed, petrochemicals are a lifeline for the fossil fuel industry. They see it that way, and that's why they're investing so much into perpetuating an unsustainable addiction to plastic.
So, but Graham, plastics are part of our lives, and they are, massively ingrained into the consumer system. And it's very clear at the moment, recycling isn't working. So where do you see this heading, and what are the possible options? And I get it. You can say to the producers, you've got to stop producing, but that's not something you can produce overnight. So just
Right.
Can you spell out to us some steps that are feasible?
Yeah, well, I mean, plastics really is a climate problem as well. We're talking about the same companies and very much see it in the same light, and governments have a massive role to play. But I think when you look at how ingrained plastic is in our economy and in our day-to-day lives, there's really simple examples of where we could change and how we can change. And so Coke, for example, produces over 100 billion bottles a year. And you don't need rocket science to think of different ways to eliminate a lot of that. And so in the global north, where you don't have the same level of problems with water, we need to move towards reuse systems. Coke has a large percentage of its business that is already reuse based. And it's a matter of setting priorities and making assumptions on where we need to go. They're much more value-based, community-based, and thinking about the real costs of the current system. Because when we say plastics is cheap, it is cheap for the companies that make it. And then in turn, consumers might pay a small price, but the price to humanity, to society overall, is actually incredibly great. And so once you really take a square look at the impacts and start to make policy decisions and make economic and business decisions based on those realities, and I think we can start to move this system. And we see a lot of small businesses with real reuse systems. And if you can do it on that sort of micro level, there's no reason why multinationals with billions of dollars to invest can't also move in that direction.
So can you give us an example? I mean, I'm just trying to think of if you're, Nestle or Unilever or something. I mean, just if I'm going into a supermarket, what could I be doing? What should they be doing? What should they be thinking of?
Yeah, so if you're a Nestle, for example, and you're going to a supermarket and looking to buy some Nescafe, they should, working with the supermarket, which is why it needs to be across the supply chain, to provide reusable sort of bins to bring your own container to get your products from that company that you want. And so, I mean, you go back even just 10, 15 years in the United States, there were so many more examples of where you could buy products in bulk. And we've just moved because the plastic has been so cheap. There's been pressure from the supply side to sort of define convenience for people in a way that's dependent on plastic. And, we see Nestle describing plastic pollution as one of the big environmental crises of our time. And I think the public has gotten their attention, and now we need to move beyond sort of the narrative change to really concrete investment. And so we need to see investors putting their money where their values are and start to change the costs of doing business so they're aligned.
Recycling, I mean, we've talked about how recycling has broken down, that the industry doesn't work and that there's no value in it. But recycling has to be part of the equation. And then how is that paid for? How do you actually make that work?
So extended producer responsibility is one way to start to get companies to pay the full costs of their products. But I think if we really want to solve the problem, we have to move our focus away from strictly looking at the end of the pipe in the recycling infrastructure. That is part of the solution, and it will be part of the solution. But as long as we continue to focus there, we are continuing to miss 80 to 90% of the picture, which focuses on the production and the oil and gas extraction and the supply chains that are so dependent on this material.
I mean, sorry, just to make that clear, you're saying you've got to close down the production side of it, but that doesn't deal with the huge amount of plastic that's already within the environment.
Right. So, I mean, we often use in the movement sort of this, analogy. If you come into your bathtub and it's overflowing with water, the first thing you do is not pick up a mop, right? The first thing you do is turn off the tap. And so as long as we don't do that and we continue to follow the industry's focus downstream, we are not giving ourselves a real chance of addressing this problem. And so we need to invest in recycling infrastructure. That needs to be part of the solution. But until we turn off the tap or even acknowledge the tap, we're not having a real conversation about addressing the problem.
Okay, I do want to get people to start putting their questions down. If you can just put your questions in the Q&A box in the bottom left-hand side. We've got people listening in Australia and the States and the UK, so we should have, I want to hear what's done in your neighborhood. What do you think is happening to the plastics in your area? We've got, if we can bring up Richard Murphy, Isabel, he's got a question just coming up. Viv, you were talking about, at the end of your article, you talked about 3 possible solutions. And I appreciate what Graham's saying is that you've got to turn off the taps and then just looking at recycling itself doesn't solve the problem. But you did I want to go through the 3 things that you mentioned at the bottom of the article. One was chemical recycling. And then another one was bioplastics and then paper package. Can you just talk briefly and maybe Graham chip in as well? So chemical recycling, what does that mean and does it really work?
Well, Graham, I'm sure will give a more exact description of this. As I understand it, it's basically mixing in petrochemicals recycled with non-recycled plastics. Is that correct, Graham? Is that the right way to describe it? So in other words, you're kind of like diluting the effects.
Which that would deal with a tiny percentage of material then in terms of the overall amount.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's that one. And then what is the bio? What are the pros and cons of bioplastic?
So the so-called bioplastics, plastics that are made out of corn or sugarcane, and now they're making plastic bags out of these kinds of biodegradable materials, natural materials. The problem with that is, so long as you are still using single-use bioplastics or regular plastics, you're still consuming an enormous amount of natural resources to produce these things. We don't have infinite amounts of arable land in the world.
Yeah, but it would seem crazy to put huge fields to creating, some
exactly, yeah.
bottles. And the last one, paper package, which we sort of talked about a bit.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a reason why we have a plastic problem, and that is because plastic is just great. I mean, it's a great material for a million different things. So you try to live one day of your life without plastic. It's very difficult. The pen you write with, the toothbrush you use to brush your teeth, whatever, from the moment you wake up. So, I think it's highly unlikely that we can start replacing everything with plastic and cardboard. And by the way, those also require natural resources to produce.
Your article said that, I mean, this is what the industry was saying, is that it's almost like plastic is a right. If you're from an emerging, economy, you should be entitled to plastics. Plastics should be part of your, development and, your economic growth. You should. I'm sitting here with, plastic containers for washing. Why can't they have it too?
Yes, that is true. And I would think that, part of the enormous soaring use of plastics is just the emerging middle class. Billions more people can afford to go out and buy a plastic bottle of laundry detergent. whereas before they simply wouldn't. And
let me get some questions coming in, and then we'll come back to you. So
oops.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
go on,
Frozen.
Richard. Go on, Richard. Go on, Richard.
Richard's back.
It's Linda, actually.
Oh, Linda, wonderful. Good to have you there.
Thank you. I was just, because I'm a local councillor, so I've got to deal with the plastics in our local community. But I'm getting
Say where you are, Linda, just so everyone knows. Whereabouts are you?
in Winchester, in south of England.
Okay.
And one of my local councillors is saying that I should be looking at gasification of waste plastic, and that's turning it into hydrogen fuel, because he wants us to have hydrogen buses, not have hydrogen cars in the future. So I just wonder what the panelists think of gasification of waste plastics as an option.
Graham, here's your opportunity to influence local government in Winchester.
Yes, and so I mean, from our side, we really move away from any idea of using plastic waste and moving it into sort of fuel. And there's several reasons for that. Usually the processes by which you do that, the impacts on sort of directly local communities. And so not knowing the details of your situation, and it's not it, I'd be wouldn't want to go too far in jumping into local issues, but it's something we really encourage folks to move away from. And I think, as Vivienne said, it's unlikely we are going to get rid of all the plastic in our lives, but really thinking about what do we do with the most problematic and most unnecessary. And we've seen a lot of local governments taking action to ban single-use plastics of certain kinds, whether it's in food delivery or other spaces. And so, we really try to, again, redirect folks upstream
Graham,
to just
Graham, let me put you on the spot. What do you do in your life, and what is it difficult for you to do? So I've talked about how we put everything in our recycling bin. We were very careful about separating things. Now they tell us to put our tin, our plastic, and our glass all on the same thing. It seems to me that it all goes into, it doesn't seem like it's being separated in any way at all. What do you actually do at home? Yeah. And what are the frustrations that you meet where you live in California?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? I have my reusable coffee cup. I've got my reusable water bottle. There's some obvious things we can sort of do as consumers, but my recycling bin fills up like 3 times a week. It's obscene, and I know where it goes, and it's not good. And so it really is systemic. And so I think there are some obvious places where you can reduce. And, I make a conscious effort, but at the end of the day, it really requires systemic change. And so it's not just going to be the local councils. It's really everyone looking at their place in the supply chain. And I encourage folks to talk to not just local governments, but national governments and big corporations about what you expect and where you want to see the change. Because I have 2 young kids, and buying food and all of those things, it's incredibly challenging, right? And it's not something that I'm going to address by myself as an individual, but understanding what I can do and then where I can push to create leverage for others to change is how I think about it. And so it's a big one.
Okay, let's take 2 questions now. Let's have Sarah Biffin and then Sheila de Belague. So Sarah first. Go ahead.
Can you read mine out, Nicholas? Because
yes,
I will.
Yeah, I will. So she says changes in public perception turn smoking from a normal and widely used activity to almost a pariah. Has public perception around plastic waste changed enough to make an appreciable change? So let's just keep that thought in mind. Have perceptions changed enough to make a difference? I mean, I would argue no, because it hasn't made a difference thus far. That's just my view. And then a really interesting contribution from Sheila de Belague, who was with us. We did a tour in India, and we went to Mumbai. Sheila, go ahead.
Yes, I'm vividly reminded of our visit to one of the biggest slums in Bombay, where millions of people are kept alive by their cottage industry of recycling. We saw them chopping up, I don't know, plastic spoons, everything they could lay hands, not just plastic, metal as well, recycling. And all these people were working away astonishingly and actually keeping themselves alive by doing that. it's really more of a comment, but I mean, I guess that these people are not going to be running out of a livelihood for a long time because there's so much existing plastic still. It's the slumdog billionaire, whatever it was, actual scenario that we visited. And the only question I had, and I don't know, we may already have touched on it while I was busy writing all this, what about glass instead of plastic, which is being used more and more, certainly in this country. For instance, I get my milk now delivered in glass bottles. Anyway, so India and recycling going on there. If you know anything about that or comment about that, it was fascinating.
Sounds like an incredible trip.
It was absolutely fantastic. But I haven't really got a proper question, but anyway.
Well, Graham, I'm interested to hear what you think about glass, because I always thought glass was, oh, well, I'll buy, my apple juice in glass bottles and not in plastic bottles. But I then discovered that that wasn't really recycled either. And that in fact, the cost of whatever was recycled was so much higher than the cost of the plastic recycling, because it's so much heavier. So I just don't know. I try to find things in cartons.
Yeah, I think the way we think about it is really about single-useness. And so confronting single-useness more as a concept and this sort of marketing tool. And so it's really thinking about reusing something over and over, because you can do different life cycle analysis to produce different results depending on, levels of reuse. But so that is the value that we lead with, is reusing. And so either as an individual or in the larger sort of system, what can be reused. And so I think that's one of the primary sort of elements that we take into account as we think about where we need to go, and also the impact associated with any given material. And so for something like glass, it can be heavily reused. We've seen, Europe and in places in the United States has a long history of bottle return schemes and sort of reuse. And I think it's really, in some ways, investing in those systems rather than phasing them out at the wishes of Coca-Cola or whoever else might be sort of pushing away from that type of system.
It's me back here again. I don't know if you covered it, but I was going to say that if you're part of the plastics industry, you would say, look, there's a real value to this. And as Sheila's pointed out, there are many, many people who are dependent upon it. And you shouldn't really be denigrating that market. It's a worthwhile, it's a genuine market. People who are very poor on the other side of the world make their living from it. Graham.
Yeah, so we work in a group called the Break Free from Plastic Movement, which has many organizational members in India and different parts of the world. And I think when we look at the vast plastics problem and how to prioritize, there's a tremendous amount of just purely unrecyclable plastic that those people working in that industry, it's problematic for them. It has no value whatsoever. And it's the primary type of plastic being pumped into places like India by Unilever, by Nestle, in the form of these little unrecyclable sachets. And so there's just so much progress to be made given the problem is so vast. And so it's really, let's start with that unrecyclable material that's completely not valuable to those people and prioritize that as a place to start eliminating. And we've heard the Unilever CEO say as much, in the sense that, they're looking at getting rid of some of that stuff, and like, no time like the present, let's get moving.
Okay, Viv, have you got something to add to that last bit?
I was going to mention a couple of things. Firstly, I just wanted to go back to what Graham was saying earlier, which I so agree with, which is that I simply don't see real change coming without very strong government action. I just don't see, there are only so many of us folks going around to, trying to think about how to change their lifestyle to address this problem. It's going to require a massive global governmental response. And the other thing I want to say is somewhat related, and sadly, is that the pandemic has been a big reversal as far as from everything I've read. Everybody has gone into, single use, craziness this year. from the facial masks on down, you know, the gigantic amount of waste being generated from facial masks, and also from, you know, takeout food cartons and all sorts of different levels. I think, and the fact that all of those recycling factories that I visited in Malaysia, of course, just closed up shop and sent their migrant, you know, workers home to Pakistan and Myanmar and other countries that they came from.
Viv, that's a really good point. I mean, Graham, it must be a very tricky thing for you. I mean, if you start saying to people, look, you know, start thinking about what you're doing with your face masks and don't order so many takeaways, and people are going to say to you, look, screw you, you know, there are people dying and I need to look after myself. I'm not going to go to the supermarket and catch COVID, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Vivienne's spot on, and the fossil fuel industry was very quick to exploit the crisis in the US and other parts of the world. I think a silver lining is that we are going to see governments taking a more proactive role in economies as we work to recover from this. And it's sort of like the build back better. Where do we put that money? What do we invest in for economic recovery? And I think there's some opportunities in there, especially when we think about plastics as part of that broader energy sort of fossil fuel conversation, for us to really make some smarter choices.
Graham, what pressure do you want put on those big companies? I mean, what kind of legislation would you want the European Union, the US to introduce to actually make them responsible to a produce less, but also to be responsible for what they produce? So just give us the idea of what concretely that legislation would be.
So fundamentally, as a principle, it's about reduction of production and reduction of use. And so we would need governments like the US to put an immediate ban on new petrochemical infrastructure sort of across the board. And then we really need companies like Nestle and Coca-Cola to be held fully to account for the plastic that they produce and use, because you know, they have a choice to make. Do they want to exist as a food business into the future, or do they want to be tied to the fossil fuel industry and sort of go down the road, which is going to be sort of a staged drawdown from their current business altogether? And so I think that's where we need to see government step up and incentivize the types of shifts towards reuse that we want to see, and really put a cap on production, just sort of flat out.
Audrey, let's bring in Audrey Wolf, because Coca-Cola has been mentioned again. You want I think you're feeling a bit defensive about Coke, Audrey. Go ahead and I didn't have you down as a major Coke drinker, but go ahead and ask your question, Audrey. Do you want to get your microphone bottom left-hand side? Go. Yeah, we can hear you now. Hi, Audrey.
Okay. Hello. Here I am. I don't want to be on here. I just want to ask about that. I thought that Coca-Cola, which is a very large company in the South, and you know, they started out not that far from where I lived in Tennessee a long time ago. But anyway, aren't they using mostly bottles and cans?
Do you mean glass bottles? Do you mean
glass bottles? Yeah, I don't remember buying a Coke.
I think, Audrey, I think they've moved on. I think they're onto plastic bottles big time. Isn't that right, Graham? And how much?
Is that true? I never buy them.
Yeah, how much plastic does Coke produce, Graham? You must have some kind of idea.
Yeah, they save all the glass bottles for their advertisements around Christmas time. But plastic, they produce over 100 billion plastic bottles every year. And they are one of the largest plastic users in the consumer goods sector.
100 billion. Who's drinking?
Yeah, that's who's drinking it. We gave it up a long time ago. That's why I don't know anything about it.
For your health, that you've given it up.
Yeah, that's a lot of Coke bottles, isn't it?
I'm
going to ask the same question again. Do you get a sense that there's political change in the offing? I'm going to come back to, you know, Sarah Biffin's question, which was, you know, is public perception turning? We've seen that with COVID, people have turned, you know, lives have got a lot smaller, and people are looking after themselves, and then environmental issues are secondary. But now, as we look ahead, the particular big changes happening in the States, we might hope, with the new administration. What potential do you see there, Graham?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need a global treaty on plastics. The US has been one of the major blocking countries for the past 4 years, with the fossil fuel industry sort of defining the US position. And we think that's likely to change, and that's going to be one of the things that we'll be working on in coming months. And so, you know, I think there is reason to be hopeful. And as I said, governments are going to be taking a more proactive role in economies around the world. So,
okay, Graham, I think you were referring to the Berne Convention on Plastics, which comes into force, I think, this month. Can you just tell us, can you just talk a bit more about that, please, and maybe they'd add to that as well, Graham?
Yeah, so the Basel Convention, right, does come into effect, and so I think the U.S. was largely left out of that for political reasons because they were an obstructionist force, which again we hope to change. But what we're really talking about the UN right now is starting to work on scope out what a global treaty on plastics could look like, and so it's absolutely needed. It needs to be part of a broader conversation around fossil fuels, and we need to move that conversation forward urgently.
So, Viv, do you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to put one other thought and hopeful thought in people's minds, and that is that, you know, these major plastics producers are all publicly traded companies, and what you're getting to see now increasingly, especially with the European big major oil companies, BP, Shell, is that there's tremendous shareholder pressure on these companies to change, to get with the environmental agenda. And they've had considerable success with this, actually. And, you know, BP just this past summer sold off its petrochemical business, much of it. It didn't want to be in plastics anymore. And I think that kind of bottom-up pressure has been one of the surprising facets of the oil industry in the last couple of years. And I think what's missing now is to make that direct link between oil production and plastics production. Still not quite there in the minds of, you know, most people.
Viv, you're based in Europe. You live in Paris, so you cover Europe a lot. Do you see a sense of, you know, where's that policy change coming? Do you see that happening in Brussels? Are there any, you know, Germans, the French? Do you see that more prevalent among particular nations at all? And just trying to get a sense of where that change is coming from.
I mean, I think that, you know, Europe, obviously anybody, and I'm sure there are many people on this call who live in Europe, will know that things have changed a lot in the last few years. I mean, just going to the store, you know, you just don't walk out of your door anymore without taking your reusable bags because you're not going to get any when you go to the store. Nobody's going to give you a plastic bag to put your groceries in. You know, those things have now become ingrained habits.
Audrey, I think you said except in Paris. Did you say, Audrey?
I said, well, that's in Paris.
That's
here,
in Paris, right.
Here they give you all the bags you want.
Where?
Right,
Where?
exactly.
Here in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, okay, so that is a sign of what governments can do.
Okay.
I mean, EU's ban on single-use plastics comes into force this month.
Yeah, okay. Let's bring in Hilary Matthews, and I'd love to see some, I mean, we do have some more conservative listeners as well. I'd love to see some questions, you know, putting some of our panelists under pressure, please. So if you've got any of your more conservative listeners, please do put a question in. Hilary Matthews, go ahead, Hilary.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, I'm most concerned about what we do about bottled water rather than Coca-Cola. There are millions and millions of people in the world that do not have access to healthy, safe drinking water. I've been in many countries where the only water you can drink is bottled. I just don't see a solution to that problem. Do you have huge, great big tanks of drinking water that people bring their reusable bottles to? I don't see. And going on from that, we still have a problem in this country. We have safe drinking water, and yet still people buy bottled water. My next door neighbor here comes home every week with 2 crates of bottled water. Why? Why aren't they using our very safe tap water? So I think bottled water is probably the biggest problem that the world is facing now.
Graham, I mean, what Hillary's referring to, there are two things. There's the bottling, getting your bottles by choice, and the other people who really don't have a choice. We do tours in the Middle East. We've looked at Jordan, we've looked at Lebanon, and we've seen refugee camps, and you see plastic bottles piled up all over the place because the only way to distribute, safe drinking water is through plastic bottles, and you're not going to get around that very quickly, are you?
Yeah, and I think access to safe drinking water is absolutely a human right that needs to be prioritized. And we have, places in the United States, Detroit, for example, where the drinking water isn't safe for many, many people in many communities. And so, that's something that absolutely should be a priority and needs to be addressed. But I think to Hillary's other point, her neighbor, for example, there's absolutely no reason why that needs to happen. And so if we're looking at sort of how do we make progress on an issue that is reaching crisis proportions globally, it's like, let's start with those very obvious examples of where we do not need bottles at the scale and at the volume that we're currently using them.
Yeah. Graham, I've got to ask you about where you're speaking to us from. Did you, it looks like the plastic windows behind you have been recycled.
That's right. Yes, I'm speaking to you from my pandemic garage office.
Okay.
So yes, I've got my 2 children inside doing school. I'm just working out here, and we're making it work in wild times.
Great. Thank you very much. It's good to see you there. Andy Mendes, you've got a point. Go ahead, Andy. Andy, go ahead. Do you want to open your microphone? We can see you're online, but we can't hear you. There you go. Go ahead.
Okay, and my machine is working.
Yeah.
It's really great to have such an uplifting conversation in the middle of being locked down in Britain. It's ever so depressing whenever you raise these topics, because it does seem to me that neither in managing carbon, CO2, or in managing plastics, we have a hope in hell, to put it gently. Unless you're prepared to get rid of people altogether, which will take a little while, or to change lifestyles in the West, let alone the 90% of the world that we're not really thinking about when we're saying about, our neighbor's got plastic bottles in his garden. Well, as you've said, you look in the Asian areas and the big populations in Africa, with every intention, there's no way you can solve those problems. So a long depressed preamble. My observation, I suppose, is that the only solutions as an ex-chemist that are even potentially there for me are the technical solutions which extract CO2 on a giant scale and do something to it, whether you store it or whatever you do with it. And similarly, where you put in an enormous international effort to extract and remove plastic from the oceans and from the environment, you can't stop its production, in my view. You need to find a way of at least creating an equilibrium in both carbon and in plastics. And if you could invent those, that would be great.
Either Viv or Graham, can you just, we haven't really spoken about it, but the impact of plastic in our oceans, the amount of plastic put into it, but also in terms of, microfibers and the actual the amount of plastic that's been broken down and then is going into the food system, into fish and into people's diets. I don't know if Graham, you want to take that first.
Vivienne, did you have a point?
No, I mean, I was going to, give some of the statistics, which I'm sure you're probably a little bit more familiar with, but as I understand it, something like 11 million tons of plastics go into our oceans every year, and that is expected to nearly triple, I believe, by 2040, I think is the estimate. The UN estimates that there will be, in terms of tonnage, more plastics than fish in the ocean by 2040 or so. So, I mean, that's a really, as Andy says, totally depressing kind of scenario. But now, and maybe I can throw this to Graham, I do understand that there are new big initiatives to like suck up all the plastics out of the ocean. And I don't know how feasible that is or what's going on with that.
Yeah, largely not feasible. And so the Ocean Cleanup was a startup in Denmark excuse me, in the Netherlands. It was getting a lot of attention. And so I think it was a great story that sort of led with story versus impact. And yeah, and I think the stats that you rattled off, Vivienne, are absolutely striking and right. It's also estimated that all of us are consuming about a credit card a week of plastic in our bodies. It's everywhere in our drinking water, in our food. And so we are, need to move urgently. And to Andy's point, I think technology can do wonderful things, and we also need to match that with political will. And if you look at what's happening in the fossil fuel sector with sort of transitions, with wind power becoming much cheaper and sort of evolving, I think it's, just really all hands on deck, and we need to do it all. And so we need technology, but what we're going to really need is an informed and activated civil society to push our leadership in the right direction to get where we need to go.
So I have more confidence in technology than I have in our political leadership.
Exactly.
Let's bring in Geraldine Gill. And then before we end, we've got about another 10 minutes to go. I'd love to just get both of you, Viv and Graham, to recap on what you think are the sort of key, what there is to hope for, what sort of kind of policies you want implementing as well. So just to think ahead before we end the program, we've got Geraldine Gill with one final point to make. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes, to Vivienne's point, up here, I live in Texas. I have brought in my own personal bags into the supermarket when I finally got the courage up to go in. And they won't let you use them. You must use the plastic. So one question is, how long do you think it will take us to break these habits that we're now forming once we get through the pandemic?
Graham, that's a grim story. That is that a familiar one for you at least? California's got a great reputation for tackling these kind of things. Jerry's in Texas, so maybe that says it.
Yeah, we're a big, beautiful, diverse country here, and I think Geraldine is in California. It's sort of, we have largely, especially along the coast, moved into a culture where it's reusable bags almost all of the time. Pre-pandemic, I think post-pandemic, what we've seen is the oil and gas sector putting that sort of climate denying lobbying machine into action. So they have done a really good job sort of stalling progress on that cultural shift. And so I don't know exactly when the timeline sort of reverts back, although we are starting to see companies and local governments start to reinstate bans on plastic bags that we hope will continue and really follow the science. We put out a statement with over 100 sort of public health experts stating that the safety of reusable bags in the pandemic. But again, it's complex. We want to make sure the workers in those stores are fully taken care of and also safe. And so I'm hopeful that as we address the broader pandemic, we'll really start to see folks moving back towards a culture of reuse that really, and building back in a way that's much more sort of sustainable and healthier, and addressing the new problems the pandemic will undoubtedly expose.
Viv, I'm so disillusioned by, I'm the pile of rubbish and stuff next to me, and to be, learning that it is being burnt or going into landfill. It would suggest that it wasn't being taken seriously, that really here in Europe, this was just for show.
Well, I'm not sure that's completely true. And of course, we do live in something of a European bubble in which, we have the kind of big government sort of mentality on certain issues. Unfortunately, I actually think this is one issue in which big government is really needed, because I don't see how else we really find a solution to this. I think we're going to have to get to a point in which it's going to be expensive to use plastic, in which you're going to have to pay per pound or per kilo of plastic waste that your household generates, and therefore you're going to go into the store and choose everything that doesn't come in a plastic bottle because you're going to have to pay when you throw it out, for example, just as one example of what governments will need to do eventually when the global plastic crisis gets to be really kind of a crisis point. I don't know what you do about, of course, the vast majority of people who are simply struggling to survive, rather than worrying about, paying per pound of plastic. That is a whole other, that's a whole other set of questions, and maybe one that will require a kind of intergovernmental response.
Okay. Well, listen, I'm going to get both of you just to do a recap and also some reasons to be cheerful, because I've got to say the last 55 minutes have been pretty depressing, because this seems to be an enormous problem with solutions that at the moment seem a long way off. But before I get you to make those reasons to be cheerful, I'm just going to say a couple of words about Viv. Viv has been writing some major stories over the past year. She's done a very recent one on France about France's slowness to get the vaccine out. And so if I can beg and borrow her to stay on after we finish this program, she might be able to stick around just for a few minutes to talk about that and how France is dealing with the vaccine. She's also covered some other major stories, so it's an opportunity for us to talk to her about her journalism. She wrote about Hungary a while back, which we've done several sessions on here. So if Viv can stay on, I would love it. So let's do a quick recap. Reasons to be cheerful, Graham, or things that we should be doing straight away. Go ahead, Graham.
Yeah, well, I think one reason to be cheerful is the issue of the plastic pollution and the crisis that we're in has really captured the hearts and minds of people all around the world like no issue has. And so that really gives me great hope. And I think we can take that public energy and that, the attention that people are really paying on this issue and translate that into government action, into really corporate pressure and pressuring corporations to transition. And I do think Vivienne's point was a really good one about the investor community and where do we put our money and where do investors put their money. And I think through that combination of prioritizing reuse, holding companies like Coca-Cola, Nestle, and PepsiCo accountable for their plastic use, I think there's tremendous progress to be made. And through crisis comes great opportunity, right? We are in a moment of disruption, and I think we can make better choices. We've learned some lessons, and I'm just hopeful by the people on this call, the attention being paid, and really this conversation. Let's have more of these, and we can make some real change in the next 2 to 3 years.
Thank you very much for that, Graham. Viv, just echo some of the things you're saying over the last hour, but also in the story, because you highlighted some real sort of pressure points that were beginning to be pressed upon in terms of change.
I mean, yes, one of the, I'm sorry to depress the folks who've like given up 1 hour of their precious time, but one of the distressing thing was how many new big petrochemical plants there were being built just in the last couple of years in the US, certainly like dozens of them, I believe. So I think I'm hopeful that if, what Graham says, the mounting kind of awareness of this issue means that we're going to put it on the political agenda, and folks who are running for mayors and city councils are going to have to answer on this issue.
Right. We have a very senior executive from one very large petrochemical company whose job it is to make plastics. He normally listens into our program. He's not on this call.
Oh, what a shame.
But thank you both very much indeed. It's been a really, really good discussion. There we're going to wrap it up. My thanks to Vivienne Walt, based in Paris, and also to Graham Forbes from Greenpeace. It's been a really worthwhile discussion. Thank you both very much.